Disclaimer: this story contains mature themes intended for adult viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. The first thing I heard wasn't a voice. It was a breath, heavy, uneven, fighting to stay steady in a room that suddenly felt too small for all the feelings inside it. When I lifted my eyes, I saw him sitting at the edge of the bed, shoulders tense, hands clasped together like he was trying to hold something fragile that kept slipping through his fingers. My husband had always been the quiet kind of strong. The kind who carried storms inside his chest without letting thunder reach his lips. But that night, even silence had weight. Across the room, the air felt different, charged, electric, alive with a tension that none of us dared name out loud. 4 people, 4 hearts beating too fast, tangled in choices that had once seemed like distant fantasies whispered only in jokes and nervous laughter. Yet here we were, standing in the fragile space between curiosity and consequence. A lingering glance. A hand that brushed another for just a second too long. Small moments that had quietly grown into something impossible to ignore. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room even when no one spoke. The dim bedroom light painted shadows across the walls, and suddenly every movement felt louder than words. My heart pounded in a rhythm that didn't belong to comfort or safety anymore, it belonged to risk. To temptation. To the strange pull of something forbidden yet strangely honest. What made it harder was the love that already existed between us. My husband wasn't a stranger. He was the man who knew the way I liked my morning coffee, the way I hummed when I cooked, the way my hand searched for his in my sleep. But love doesn't make curiosity disappear. Sometimes it only makes it more complicated. And in that quiet room, with breaths growing heavier and emotions rising like a tide no one could stop, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a game anymore. Because when I finally glanced back at my husband, I saw the moment his strength began to crack, not with anger, not with shouting, but with the fragile silence of a man trying to be brave while his heart slowly broke. And that was the moment I knew nothing between us would ever be simple again. The room stayed quiet long after that moment passed, but the silence had changed. It was no longer empty, it was full of things none of us knew how to say. I stayed where I was, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the mattress as if the bed itself might steady me. Across from me, my husband still hadn't moved. His eyes were fixed on the floor, but I could see the slow rise and fall of his chest, each breath deeper than the last, as though he was trying to collect himself piece by fragile piece. I wanted to go to him. Every instinct inside me whispered that I should cross the room, kneel beside him, and remind him that nothing in this world had ever mattered to me more than the life we had built together. But something held me there. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the quiet electricity that had been building between all of us for weeks, in shared dinners, in laughter that lingered just a second too long, in glances that slipped away before they could be caught. What had once been harmless now felt dangerously real. When I looked up again, I met someone else's gaze. He stood near the window, the soft glow of the lamp outlining his figure against the dark glass. His expression wasn't bold or demanding. If anything, he looked just as unsure as I felt. His hand rested against the back of a chair, fingers tapping lightly, like he was trying to ground himself. For a moment, neither of us looked away. It was strange how much could pass between 2 people in a single silent stare. Questions. Doubt. A pull neither of us had planned. Then he spoke, quietly, almost carefully. "Are you okay?" The question wasn't dramatic, but it landed deep. Not because of the words, but because of the way he asked them. Like he truly meant it. I nodded before I even realized I had. "I think so." My voice sounded softer than I expected. Behind me, the mattress shifted slightly as my husband adjusted his posture. The small movement made my chest tighten. I glanced over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of his face for the first time since everything began to feel different. His eyes were tired, but they were still gentle. That gentleness almost undid me. When I turned back, the man by the window had stepped a little closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence in the room. Neither of us reached out. But for a brief second, Our hands came close enough that the air between them felt warmer. And somehow, that almost touch felt louder than anything anyone could say. The quiet stretched longer than anyone expected. It wrapped around the room like a thick fog, heavy with thoughts none of us dared to speak aloud. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant hum of traffic somewhere beyond the window. Ordinary sounds. Normal sounds. Yet nothing about this moment felt normal anymore. My eyes drifted back to my husband. He hadn't left the edge of the bed. His elbows rested on his knees now, his hands clasped loosely as if he were holding on to the last thread of certainty he had left. I knew that posture. I had seen it before during difficult days, when life pressed too hard on his shoulders. But tonight was different. Tonight, the weight came from inside the room. A quiet movement beside me drew my attention again. The man near the window had taken another small step forward, cautious, like someone approaching the edge of unfamiliar ground. His expression carried the same mixture of curiosity and restraint that I felt tangled inside my chest. Neither of us spoke. Yet the distance between us suddenly felt much smaller. I became aware of the tiniest details, the warmth of the room, the faint scent of cologne, the way the soft light caught in his eyes when he looked at me. It wasn't bold or demanding. If anything, it was careful, almost hesitant. And somehow that made it harder to ignore. My fingers shifted slightly against the mattress as I steadied myself. At that exact moment, his hand moved too, not reaching, not grabbing, just adjusting his balance as he leaned closer to speak. Our fingers brushed. It was barely anything. A brief graze. The kind of contact that could easily be dismissed as an accident. But neither of us moved right away. For a single suspended second, that tiny point of contact felt louder than the entire room. Then he pulled his hand back. Not abruptly. Not awkwardly. Just enough to rebuild the invisible line that had been there before. I swallowed, my heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. Across the room, the other woman watched quietly, her arms folded loosely as if she too were trying to understand what we had all stepped into tonight. There was no judgment in her face, only a thoughtful calm, like someone witnessing a fragile moment that could still turn in any direction. The air between us felt warmer now, charged with something deeper than curiosity. But every time the tension threatened to tip too far, the same thought returned to me. Love was still sitting on that bed behind me. And when I finally glanced over my shoulder again, my husband lifted his eyes just enough to meet mine. There was no anger there. Only a quiet question neither of us yet had the courage to answer. The silence deepened until it almost felt alive. No one had moved for several seconds, yet the atmosphere in the room kept shifting, tightening, stretching, breathing with every heartbeat. I could feel it in my chest, in the warmth of my skin, in the way my fingers curled slightly against the mattress as if trying to hold onto something steady. But nothing about this moment was steady anymore. I slowly stood. The movement was small, yet it seemed to draw every eye in the room. My husband looked up again, his expression soft but fragile, like someone bracing for a truth he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. For a moment I thought about going to him. About crossing the room and letting everything return to the safety we had always known. But my feet carried me somewhere else. Only a few steps. Close enough that I could see the faint tension in the other man's jaw, the way he held his breath as if even the air between us mattered. His eyes searched my face, not boldly, but carefully, like he was trying to understand something that even I hadn't fully admitted yet. I didn't expect tonight to feel like this, I said quietly. My voice barely rose above a whisper, but it seemed to settle heavily in the room. He nodded slowly. Neither did I. Another pause followed. The kind that isn't empty, but full of everything people are afraid to say out loud. I could feel the warmth of his presence now, the subtle closeness of standing only inches apart. My heart beat harder with every passing second, each thump louder in my ears. Then he spoke again, softer this time. You look like you're standing on the edge of something. The words struck deeper than he probably intended. Because he was right. I was. Behind me, I knew my husband was still there. I could feel the quiet gravity of him in the room, the history we shared, the promises that had shaped our lives together. That love hadn't disappeared. But something new had entered the space between all of us tonight. Something uncertain. Something dangerously honest. My hand lifted before I could stop it, hesitating in the air between us. Not reaching all the way. Just hovering in that fragile distance where a single inch could change everything. His gaze dropped briefly to my hand, then back to my eyes. Neither of us moved. But in that suspended moment, with the room holding its breath and the world outside fading into nothing, it felt like we were already standing inside a choice neither of us could take back. And the terrifying part was, I wasn't sure I wanted to step away. Rain began sometime after midnight. At first it was only a soft tapping against the window, a quiet rhythm that blended with the slow breathing inside the room. The lamp on the bedside table cast a warm, golden glow across the walls, turning shadows into something gentle instead of heavy. The night felt different now. Not tense the way it had been before, but fragile, like the air just after a storm breaks open. I stood near the window, watching thin lines of rain slide down the glass. Behind me, the room moved slowly, quietly, as though everyone inside it understood that something important was unfolding. No one rushed. No one pushed. Somewhere along the way, the fear that had filled the room earlier had softened into something deeper, a strange mixture of vulnerability and trust. When I turned around, he was standing there. Closer than before. The dim light softened the edges of his face, but I could still see the uncertainty in his eyes. Not hesitation, something gentler than that. The kind of careful awareness people carry when they know a single moment can change everything. For a few seconds, we simply looked at one another. Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance. You can still walk away, he said quietly. His voice held no pressure, no expectation. Just honesty. I thought about that. About the life that had brought me here. About the love that still existed in the room behind me. About the complicated, human truth that hearts are rarely simple things. Then I shook my head, slowly. I don't want to run from what I feel anymore. The words felt strange and freeing at the same time. Something in his expression softened, like a door opening just a little wider. The distance between us closed naturally, not with urgency, but with quiet gravity. When his hand finally found mine, it wasn't sudden or overwhelming. It was warm, steady, grounding. My breath caught anyway. The touch was simple, yet it carried the weight of every unsaid feeling that had filled the night. My fingers curled slightly with his, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact. Rain pressed harder against the window. He stepped closer, and the warmth of him surrounded me, not consuming, not demanding, just present. My heartbeat matched the slow rhythm of the storm outside. When I leaned into him, it felt less like a decision and more like gravity finally doing its work. My forehead rested briefly against his shoulder, and his breath brushed softly through my hair. The quiet closeness held more meaning than any words could manage. For a long moment we stayed like that. Breathing. Listening. Feeling. Our breaths slowly fell into the same rhythm, until it felt like the silence itself was speaking for us. My hand rested lightly against his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath it. 2 heartbeats, close enough to hear. 2 people standing at the edge of a moment that would stay with them forever. And somewhere in the quiet warmth of that stormlit room, we finally stopped pretending we couldn't feel it. Morning arrived quietly. The rain had stopped sometime before sunrise, leaving the world outside washed clean and strangely calm. Pale light slipped through the curtains, soft and hesitant, as if even the sun understood the delicate silence that filled the room. For a long time, no one spoke. The house felt different in the morning. Not heavier, exactly, but fuller. As though the walls themselves were holding on to everything the night had witnessed. I stood near the kitchen window, my hands wrapped around a mug that had long since stopped steaming. Outside, drops of water clung to the leaves in the garden, trembling every time a breeze passed through. Behind me, footsteps moved slowly across the floor. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. You didn't sleep much either, did you? My husband said quietly. His voice carried no sharpness. No accusation. Just tired honesty. I exhaled slowly and turned to face him. The morning light softened the lines of his face, but it couldn't hide the depth in his eyes, the thoughts that had clearly followed him through the night. No, I admitted. For a moment we simply looked at each other. Years of shared mornings lived in that silence. Coffee cups. Lazy Sundays. Quiet laughter over nothing important at all. The kind of life people build piece by piece without realizing how strong it becomes. And yet something had shifted. Not broken. Shifted. He leaned against the counter across from me, folding his arms loosely as if he were choosing his next words with care. I kept asking myself one question, he said. I felt my chest tighten slightly. What question? His gaze dropped briefly to the floor before returning to mine. Whether what happened last night was about losing something, or discovering something. The honesty of it startled me. Before I could answer, another sound came from the hallway, the soft creak of a door opening. A moment later, the others appeared, moving slowly, carrying the same quiet awareness that hung in the air between all of us. No one looked triumphant. No one looked ashamed. Just thoughtful. Human. The man from the night before paused near the doorway, his eyes meeting mine for only a second. There was something different there now, not the restless tension of before, but a deeper understanding neither of us had expected to find. Then, unexpectedly, my husband spoke again. Maybe the harder question, he said calmly, is what we do with that discovery now. The room fell still. Morning light stretched across the floor, warm and honest. And for the first time since the storm had begun, it felt like the real story wasn't about what happened last night, it was about what would happen next. Morning slowly unfolded into afternoon, and with it came the quiet understanding that the night had changed something none of us could undo. But change, I realized, isn't always destruction. Sometimes it's revelation. The four of us sat together in the living room later that day, sunlight pouring through the tall windows like a gentle witness. No one seemed rushed to speak. Cups of coffee rested half-finished on the table, forgotten as thoughts moved deeper than ordinary conversation. I looked at my husband. Really looked at him. The man who had stood beside me through years of ordinary days and quiet victories. The man whose presence had always felt like home, even when life became complicated. He caught my gaze and gave a small, tired smile. Not the smile of someone defeated. The smile of someone who had walked through a storm and come out with clearer eyes. I think last night showed us something important, he said softly. The room listened. That love doesn't disappear just because we feel something new. It just asks us to be honest. His words settled over us like warm sunlight. Across the room, the other couple exchanged a glance that carried its own understanding, not regret, not triumph, but a strange gratitude for the fragile moment we had all shared. I realized then that what happened between us hadn't been about replacing love or escaping it. It had been about facing the complicated truth of being human. Curious. Vulnerable. Capable of more feeling than we sometimes know what to do with. My husband stood and walked toward me slowly. For a second my heart jumped, unsure of what his next step meant. But when he reached me, he simply placed his hand gently on the side of my face. The touch was warm. Familiar. Home. He leaned forward and rested his forehead against mine, a quiet gesture we had shared 1,000 times before. Only now it felt deeper. More deliberate. I'm still here, he whispered. Emotion caught in my throat, but I nodded. So am I. Across the room, our friends prepared to leave, offering soft smiles and quiet goodbyes. There were no dramatic farewells, only the understanding that some nights stay with you forever, not because of what happened, but because of what they reveal. As the door closed behind them, the house felt calm again. Different, yes, but peaceful. And when my husband wrapped his arms around me, I understood something simple and powerful. Some stories don't end in breaking apart. Sometimes, they end with two hearts choosing each other again, with clearer eyes than before.